Alas, Poor Annabelle by Carol Ryrie Brink from Caddy Woodlawn. The following excerpt from Caddy Woodlawn describes a visit from Caddy's cousin Annabelle. Annabelle was the perfect little lady from Boston who did not know what to expect when visiting her tomboy cousin out west. Annabelle learned about the West, but Caddy learned something even more important. There were rains after that, and things grew green again. And presently it was time for Cousin Annabelle to arrive on the little steamer. Mrs. Hyman and Katie had come out to help make the girls' new summer dresses, and Clara and Mother had been in their element, turning the pages of the Godey's Ladies' book and talking of muslin, bodices, buttons, and braids. "Of course," said Clara sadly, "anything we can make here will be sure to be 6 months behind the fashions in Boston, to say the least, and I do wish I might have hoops for every day." "I don't," cried Caddy. "Good gracious! Every time I sit down in hoops, they fly up and hit me in the nose." "That's because you don't know how to manage them," said Clara. "There's an art to wearing hoops, and I suppose you're too much of a tomboy ever to learn it." "I suppose so," said Caddy cheerfully, but to herself she added, "I'm not really so much of a tomboy as they think. Perhaps I shall wear hoops some day, but only when I get good and ready." Then, one day, Cousin Annabelle came. The little steamer seemed full of her little round-topped trunks and boxes, and after they had all been carried off, down the gangplank tripped Annabelle Gray herself in her tiny buttoned shoes, with her tiny hat tilted over her nose and its velvet streamers floating out behind. Clara and Caddy had been allowed to come with Mother and Father to meet her, and Caddy suddenly felt all clumsy hands and feet when she saw this delicate apparition. "Dearest Auntie Harriet, what a pleasure this is!" cried Annabelle in a voice as cultivated as her penmanship. "And this is Uncle John? And these little cousins? How quaint and rustic it is here! But just a moment, let me count my boxes. There ought to be 7. Yes, that's right, they're all here. Now we can go." Father piled the 7 boxes in the back of the wagon, and Clara and Caddy climbed in on top of them, while Annabelle sat between Mother and Father, her full skirts billowing over their knees. Above the rattle of the wagon wheels, her cultivated voice ran on and on. Clara leaned forward to catch what they were saying and sometimes put in a word of her own, but Caddy sat tongue-tied and uncomfortable, conscious only of her own awkwardness and of a sharp lock on one of Annabelle's boxes, which hurt her leg whenever they went over a bump. When they reached the farm, Hetty, Minnie, and the boys ran out and stood in a smiling row beside the wagon. Tom held baby Joe in his arms. "Dear me," said Cousin Annabelle, "are these children all yours, Auntie Harriet?" "There are only 7, said Mother, "and every one is precious." "Of course, Mother told me there were 7, but they do look such a lot when one sees them all together, don't they?" "I picked you a nosegay," said Hetty, holding out a rather wilted bunch of flowers, which she had been clutching tightly in her warm hands for a long time. "How very thoughtful of you, little girl," said Annabelle. "But do hold it for me, won't you? I should hate to stain my mitts. You've no idea what a dirty journey this has been, and what difficulty I have had in keeping clean." "You look very sweet and fresh, my dear," said Mother, "but I'm sure that you must be tired. Come in and take a cup of tea." Caddy stayed outside a moment to put a quick arm about Hetty's shoulders. "That was an awful pretty nosegay you made anyway, Hetty," she said. Hetty's downcast face suddenly shone bright again. "Yes, it was, wasn't it, Caddy? Would you like it?" "Why, yes, I would. I think I would look real nice here on my new dress, don't you?" "Oh, it would be lovely, Caddy." That evening, everyone listened to Annabelle telling about Boston. Mother's eyes shone, and her cheeks were pinker than usual. It had been a good many years now since she had been one of her own kin, since she had seen one of her own kin direct from home. Now she could find out whether Grandma Gray's rheumatism was really better, or whether they only wrote that to reassure her. She could find out what pattern of silk Cousin Kitty had chosen for her wedding gown. Who had been lecturing in Boston this winter? What new books had come out since the end of the war? Why Aunt Phoebe had forgotten to write to her, and 100 other things that she longed to know, but could never get them to put into letters. From time to time, Father glanced at her happy face over the old newspapers which Annabelle had brought him. It was only at a moment such as this that Father understood how much Mother had given up when she left Boston to come with him to Wisconsin. But after an hour or so of Boston gossip, Tom grew restless. Both he and Caddy were well tired of Annabelle's city airs. "Well, I guess Boston's a pretty good place, all right, but how about Dunville?" Tom said. Cousin Annabelle's silvery laughter filled the room. "Why, Tom, Boston is one of the world's greatest cities, the only one I'd care to live in, I'm sure, and Dunville, well, it's just too quaint and rustic, but it isn't even on the maps yet." "Why, Tom," echoed Hetty seriously, "you hadn't ought to have said that. I guess Boston is just like heaven, Tom." Everyone burst out laughing at this, and Cousin Annabelle rose and shook her flounces, preparatory to going to bed. "But really, Tom," she said, "I want you to show me everything in your savage country. I want to be just as uncivilized as you are while I'm here. I shall learn to ride horseback and milk the cows and salt the sheep, if that is what you do, and turn somersaults in the haymow, and what else do you do?" "Oh, lots of things," said Tom, and suddenly there was an impish twinkle in his eyes. "And you, Caroline," said Annabelle, turning to Caddy, "I suppose that you do all of those amusing things too?" "Yes, I'm afraid I do, Cousin Annabelle," replied Caddy. She tried to avoid Tom's eyes, but somehow it seemed impossible, and for just an instant an impish twinkle in her own met and danced with the impish twinkle in Tom's. "You must begin to teach me tomorrow," said Annabelle sweetly. "I'm sure that it will be most interesting. And now, if you will excuse me, I'm really quite fatigued." "Yes, of course, dear Annabelle, and you're to sleep with me," said Clara, linking her arm through Annabelle's and leading her upstairs. The next morning, Tom, Caddy, and Warren had a brief consultation behind the straw stack. They ran through the list of practical jokes which they were used to playing when Uncle Edmund was among them. "We can make up better ones than most of those," said Tom confidently. "It'll do her good." "Let's see," said Caddy dreamily. "She wants to ride horseback and salt the sheep and turn somersaults in the haymow. Yes, I think that we can manage." "What fun!" chirped Warren, turning a handspring. When they entered the house, Annabelle had just come bouncing down the stairs, resolved upon being uncivilized for the day. She wore a beautiful new dress, which was of such a novel style and cut that Mother and Clara could not admire it enough. Up and down both front and back of the fitted bodice was a row of tiny black jet buttons that stood out and sparkled at you when you looked at them. "You don't need all those buttons to fasten up your dress, do you?" said Warren. "Of course not," laughed Annabelle. "They're for decoration. All the girls in Boston are wearing them now, but none of them have as many buttons as I have. I have 88, and that's 6 more than Bessie Beasley and 14 more than Mary Adams." "You don't say," said Tom, and once again he and Caddy exchanged a twinkling glance. "When shall I have my riding lessons?" asked Annabelle after breakfast. "Right away, if you'd like," said Caddy pleasantly. Clara stayed to help Mother, and Minnie was playing with Baby Joe, but Hetty came with the others. "Hadn't you better stay with Mother, Hetty?" said Tom in his kindest voice. But no, Hetty wanted to see the riding lesson. Annabelle chattered vivaciously of how much better everything was done in Boston, while Tom went into the barn to bring out the horse. "Why, Tom," cried Hetty when he returned, "that's not Betsy, that's Pete." Pete was perfectly gentle in appearance, but he had one trick which had kept the children off his back for several years. "Hetty," said Caddy firmly, "we must have perfect quiet while anyone is learning to ride. If you can't be perfectly quiet, we'll have to send you right back to the house." "I suppose he bucks," said Cousin Annabelle. "All Western horses do, don't they? Shall I be hurt?" "He's pretty gentle," said Tom. "You better get on and you'll find out." Bareback and astride, quavered Annabelle. Dear me, how quaint and rustic. Caddy and Tom helped her on. He hasn't started bucking yet, said Annabelle proudly. I knew that I should be a good rider. Just touch him with the switch a little, advised Tom. At the touch of the switch, Pete swung into a gentle canter, but instead of following the road, he made for a particular shed at the back of the barn. It was Pete's one accomplishment. How do I pull the rein to make him go the other way? Queried Annabelle. But already Pete was gathering momentum, and before they could answer, he had swung in under the low shed, scraped Annabelle neatly off into the dust, and was standing peacefully at rest inside the shed, picking up wisps of hay. Annabelle sat up in a daze. The little straw sun hat, which she had insisted on wearing, was over one ear, and she looked very comical indeed. I don't yet understand what happened, she said politely. I thought that I was going along so well. In Boston, I'm sure the horses never behave like that. Would you like to try another horse? Said Tom. Oh, no, said Annabelle hastily. Not today, at least. Couldn't we go and salt the sheep now, perhaps? Do you think we could, Tom? Asked Caddy doubtfully. Why, yes, I believe we could, said Tom kindly. Here, let me help you up, Cousin Annabelle. I'll get the salt, shouted Warren, racing into the barn. Hetty looked on in silence, her eyes round with surprise. Annabelle rose a bit stiffly and brushed the back of her beautiful dress. She's not a crybaby at any rate, thought Caddy to herself. Maybe it's kind of mean to play another trick on her. But Warren had already returned with the salt, and he and Tom, with Annabelle between them, were sitting out for the woodland pasture, where Father kept the sheep. Caddy hastened to catch up with them, and Hetty, still wondering, tagged along behind. Will they eat out of my hand if I hold it for them? Asked Annabelle, taking the chunk of salt from Warren. Sure, said Tom. They're crazy about salt. But you mustn't hold it, said Hetty, coming up panting. You must lay it down where the sheep can get it. Now, Hetty, said Caddy, what did I tell you about keeping perfectly quiet? You do just as you like, Annabelle. Well, of course, said Annabelle. I should prefer to hold it and let the cunning little lambs eat it right out of my hands. All right, said Tom. You go in alone then, and we'll stay outside the fence here where we can watch you. It's so nice of you to let me do it, said Cousin Annabelle. How do you call them? Tom uttered a low, persuasive call, the call to salt. He uttered it 2 or 3 times, and sheep began coming from all parts of the woods into the open pasture. Annabelle stood there expectantly, holding out the salt, a bright smile on her face. We don't have sheep in Boston, she said, but almost immediately the smile began to fade. The sheep were crowding all around her, so close that she could hardly move. They were treading on her toes and climbing on each other's back to get near her. Frightened, she held the salt up out of their reach, and then they began to try to climb up her as if she had been a ladder. There was a perfect pandemonium of bleating and baaing, and above this noise rose Annabelle's despairing shriek. Drop the salt and run, called Tom, himself a little frightened, with 30 or 40 sheep around her, all still believing that she held the salt. At last, poor Annabelle succeeded in breaking away, and they helped her over the fence. But when she was safe on the other side, everybody stopped and looked at her in amazement. The 80 sparkling jet buttons had disappeared from her beautiful frock. The sheep had eaten them. Oh, my buttons! Cried Annabelle. There were 80 of them, 6 more than Bessie Beasley had, and where is my sun hat? Across the fence and the milling crowd of sheep, the wicked woodlawns beheld with glee Annabelle's beautiful sun hat rakishly dangling from the left horn of a fat old ram. If Annabelle had rushed home crying and told Mother, the Woodlawn children would not have been greatly surprised, but there seemed to be more in Annabelle than meet the eye. What a quaint experience, she said. They'll hardly believe it when I tell them about it in Boston. Her voice was a trifle shaky, but just as polite as ever, and she went right upstairs without speaking to Clara or Mother and changed to another dress. That evening she was more quiet than she had been the night before, and she had almost nothing to say about the superiority of her native city over the rest of the uncivilized world. Caddy noticed with remorse that Annabelle walked a little stiffly, and she surmised that the ground had not been very soft at the place where Pete had scraped her off. I wish I hadn't promised Tom to play the next trick on her, Caddy thought to herself. Maybe he'll let me off. But Tom said no. It was a good trick, and Annabelle had asked for it, and Caddy had promised to do her part, and she had better go through with it. All right, Caddy said. After all, it was a good trick, and Annabelle had asked for it. Let's see, said Tom the next day. You wanted to turn somersaults in the haymow, didn't you, Cousin Annabelle? Well, I do suppose that's one of the things one always does on a farm, isn't it? Said Cousin Annabelle, a trifle less eagerly than she had welcomed their suggestions of the day before. The beautiful 8 button dress had not appeared today. Annabelle had on a loose blouse over a neat full skirt. Of course, I never turn somersaults in Boston, you understand. It's so very quaint and rustic. Of course we understand that, said Caddy. But out here, where you have lots of hay, it's bully fun, yelled Warren. Now, Hetty, directed Tom, you better stay at home with Minnie. A little girl like you might fall down the ladder to the mow and hurt herself. Me fall down the haymow ladder? Demanded Hetty in amazement. Why, Tom Woodlawn, you're just plumb crazy. Well, run into the house then and fetch us some cookies, said Tom, anxious to be rid of Hetty's astonished eyes and tattling tongue. Hetty departed reluctantly with a deep conviction that she was missing out on something stupendous. When she returned a few minutes later with her hands full of cookies, she could hear them all laughing and turning somersaults in the loft above. She made haste to climb the ladder and peer into the loft. It was darkish there, with dust motes dancing in the rays of light that entered through the chinking. But Hetty could see quite plainly, and what she saw was Caddy slipping an egg down the back of Annabelle's blouse, just as Annabelle was starting to turn a somersault. I can turn them every bit as well as you already, said Annabelle triumphantly, and then she turned over. And then she sat up with a surprised and stricken look upon her face, and then she began to cry. Oh, it's squishy, she sobbed. You're horrid and mean. I didn't mind falling off the horse or salting the sheep, but oh, this is squishy. Hetty climbed down from the haymow and ran to the house as fast as she could go. Mother, if you want to see something, you just come here with me as fast as you can, she cried. On the way down to the barn, she gave Mrs. Woodlawn a brief but graphic account of the riding lesson and the sheep salting. When they reached the haymow, Annabelle was still sobbing. Oh, Auntie Harriet, she cried, I don't know what it is, but it's squishy. Oh dear, I can't bear squishy things. You poor child, said Mrs. Woodlawn, examining the back of Annabelle's blouse, and then in an ominous voice she announced, It's egg. With a good deal of tenderness, Mother got Annabelle to the house and put her into Clara's capable hands. Then she turned with fury on the three culprits, but it was Caddy whom she singled out for punishment. Caroline Woodlawn, stand forth, she cried. Caddy obeyed. It was only a joke, Mother, she said in a quivering voice. Mrs. Woodlawn took a little riding whip which hung behind the kitchen door and struck Caddy 3 times across the legs. Now go to your bed and stay until morning. You shall have no supper. Ma, it was as much my fault as hers, cried Tom, his ruddy face gone white. No, Tom, said Mrs. Woodlawn, I cannot blame you so much. But that a daughter of mine should so far forget herself in her hospitality to a guest, that she should be such a hoyden as to neglect her proper duties as a lady. Shame to her, shame! No punishment that I can invent would be sufficient for her. As Caddy went upstairs, she saw Father standing in the kitchen door, and she knew that he had witnessed her disgrace. But she knew, too, that he would do nothing to soften the sentence which Mother had spoken, for it was an unwritten family law that one parent never interfered with the justice dealt out by the other. For hours Caddy tossed about on her bed, The upper room was hot and close, but an even hot inner fire burned in Caddy. She had some of her mother's quick temper, and she was stung by injustice. She would have accepted punishment without question if it had been dealt out equally to the boys. But the boys had gone free. All the remorse and the resolve to do better, which had welled up in her as soon as she had seen Annabelle's tears, were dried up now at the injustice of her punishment. Hot and dry-eyed, she tossed about on the little bed where she had spent so many quiet hours. At last, she got up and tied a few things in which she most valued into a towel. She put them under the foot of her mattress and lay down again. Later, she would slip down to the kitchen and get a loaf of bread and Father's old water bottle, which she would fill at the spring. At least they could not begrudge her that much. They would soon cease to miss her. Perhaps they would adopt Annabelle in her place. Her anger cooled a little in the fever of making plans. It would have been much easier if she had known just where the Indians were. But at this season, the woods were full of berries, and there would soon be nuts. John's dog would protect her, and she could live a long time in the woods until she could join the Indians. She knew that they would take her in, and then she would never have to grow into that hateful thing which Mother was always talking about, a lady. A lady with fine airs and mincing walk, who was afraid to go out into the sun without a hat or a sunshade. A lady who made samplers and wore stays and was falsely polite no matter how she felt. A soft blue twilight fell, and still Caddy tossed, hot, resentful, and determined. There was the clatter of supper dishes down below, and no one relented enough to send her a bite of bread. A velvet darkness followed the twilight, and through the windows summer stars began to twinkle. Presently Hetty and Minnie came up to bed. Hetty came and stood by Caddy's bed and looked at her. Caddy could feel the long, wistful look, but she did not stir or open her eyes. Hetty was a tattletale. It was torture to have to lie so still, but at last the little sisters were breathing the regular breath of sleep, and Caddy could toss and turn as much as she pleased. She must keep awake now until the house was all still and the lights out, and then she would be free to run away. Her heart beat fast, and with every beat something hot and painful seemed to throb in her head. A cooler breeze began to come in at the window. How long it took the house to grow quiet tonight. How tiresome they were. They wouldn't even go to bed and let her run away. Then the door creaked a little on its hinges. There was a glimmer of candlelight, and Father came in. He went first and looked at Minnie and Hetty. He put a lock of hair back from Minnie's forehead and pulled the sheet up over Hetty's shoulder. Then he came and stood by Caddy's bed. She lay very still with tightly closed eyes so that Father should think her asleep. It had fooled Hetty, but Father knew more than most people did. He put the candle down and sat on the side of the bed and took one of Caddy's hot hands in his cool ones. Then he began to speak in his nice quiet voice, without asking her to wake up or open her eyes or look at him. "Perhaps Mother was a little hasty today, Caddy," he said. "She really loves you very much, and, you see, she expects more of you than she would of someone she didn't care about. It's a strange thing, but somehow we expect more of girls than boys. It is the sisters and wives and mothers, you know, Caddy, who keep the world sweet and beautiful. What a rough world it would be if there were only men and boys in it, doing things in their rough way. A woman's task is to teach them gentleness and courtesy and love and kindness. It's a big task, too, Caddy, harder than cutting trees or building mills or damming rivers. It takes nerve and courage and patience, but good women have those things. They have them just as much as the men who build bridges and carve roads through the wilderness. A woman's work is something fine and noble to grow up to, and it is just as important as a man's. But no man could ever do it so well. I don't want you to be the silly, affected person with fine clothes and manners whom folks sometimes call a lady. No, that is not what I want for you, my little girl. I want you to be a woman with a wise and understanding heart, healthy in body and honest in mind. Do you think you would like to be growing up into that woman now? How about it, Caddy? Have we run with the colts long enough?" There was a little silence, and the hot tears, which had not wanted to come all day, were suddenly running down Caddy's cheeks unhealed into the pillow. "You know, Caddy," added Father gently and half apologetically, "you know, I'm sort of responsible for you, honey. I was the one who urged Mother to let you run wild, because I thought it was the finest way to make a splendid woman of you. And I still believe that, Caddy." Suddenly, Caddy flung herself into Mr. Woodlawn's arms. "Father! Father!" It was all she could say, and really there was nothing more that needed saying. Mr. Woodlawn held her a long time, his rough beard pressed against her cheek. Then, with his big hands, which were so delicate with clockwork, he helped her to undress and straighten the tumbled bed. Then he kissed her again and took his candle and went away. And now the room was cool and pleasant again, and even Caddy's tears were not unpleasant, but part of the cool relief she felt. In a few moments she was fast asleep. But something strange had happened to Caddy in the night. When she awoke, she knew she need not be afraid of growing up. It was not just sewing and weaving and wearing stays. It was something more thrilling than that. It was a responsibility, but as Father spoke of it, it was a beautiful and precious one, and Caddy was ready to go and meet it. She looked at the yellow sunshine on the floor, and she knew that she had slept much longer than she usually did. Both Hetty's and Minnie's beds were empty, but as soon as Caddy began to stir around, Hetty came in as if she had been waiting outside the door. "Oh, say, Caddy," she said, "I'm awful sorry. I went and told on you yesterday. Honest I am. I never thought you'd get it so hard, and I'll tell you what, I'm not going to be a tattler ever any more. I'm not. But say, Caddy, I wanted to be the first to tell you Father took Tom and Warren out to the barn yesterday afternoon, and he gave 'em both a thrashing. He said it wasn't fair that you should have all the punishment when the same law had always governed you all, and Tom said so too, although he yelled good and plenty when he was being thrashed." "It's all right, Hetty," said Caddy. "I guess we won't be playing any more silly jokes on people." "What's this?" asked Hetty, pulling at the corner of a queer bundle that stuck out under the corner of Caddy's mattress. Out came a knotted towel with an odd assortment of Caddy's treasures rattling around inside. "Oh, that," said Caddy, untying the knots and putting the things away. "Those are just some things I was looking at yesterday when I had to stay up here alone."